At 4:40 that afternoon, the bank woman said my name like it belonged to someone else. "Mr. Mercer, we need to verify unusual activity." I stood in my office watching rain slam sideways against the window, while my company's accounts got scraped clean in real time. My name is Tobin Mercer. I'm 58 now. I live in Seattle, and I still hate cold rain because it sounds like that phone call. Back then, I was 36 and running a high-end corporate event production company. Product launches, executive retreats, fancy hotel contracts. Nothing shady, just deposits, timing, and trust. Keegan Vale was my smooth-talking growth guy. He sat beside me in meetings for years, smiled at clients, and shook hands like he owned the room. He knew every login, every vendor, every weakness, because I let him in. The banker pulled up the details and her tone turned careful. A chain of transfers, then an emergency credit draw, all authorized by my signature. I told her, "That was not me and you know it." She kept saying policy, escalation, fraud department, like those words were supposed to put money back. My phone lit up with other calls before hers even ended. A lighting vendor demanded payment. A caterer said they were walking. 2 clients canceled within minutes, angry and scared. Then my lender called and said, "I need an answer before close of business." I stared at the wall calendar like it could argue for me. Quick note, before listening, share which city or country you're watching from, and let's continue. The worst part was what I'd done 3 months earlier. I'd personally guaranteed a bridge loan. I'd tied some of my own assets to it because I believed we'd ride out a slow quarter. I remembered signing that guarantee, the pen heavy, Keegan nodding like my partner. Now that same guarantee felt like a steel collar I couldn't loosen. I hung up, grabbed my coat, and drove home with my hands locked on the wheel until my fingers cramped. Seattle looked guilty in the dusk. Wet streets, brake lights smeared, wind pushing rain under every hood and collar. I kept telling myself my wife, Maren, would be the one steady thing left. She was in the living room like it was any other Wednesday. Tea on the table, soft music, phone in her hand. That calm face she used in front of donors and gallery people. I didn't ease into it. "Keegan emptied the operating account and the reserve," I said. "He vanished. Vendors aren't being paid. 2 clients already canceled. The debt is about to slam into my name." Maren didn't flinch. She asked one question, flat and clean. "So what does that mean for me?" Then she slid a folder across the coffee table and said, "You already signed what it means." And I snatched it and tore it open. Paper slid out onto the table, crisp and already organized. The first page wasn't a messy divorce filing. It was a post-nuptial agreement and asset split, dated a few weeks earlier. The wording was so clean and final it felt like I'd been dead when I signed it, like my name was just a stamp on her exit. I stared at the signature block and remembered the night she called it an insurance update. I'd been half asleep at the kitchen island, tie tossed aside, brain fried from work, and she'd set the pages in front of me like it was routine. Little sticky notes pointed to the lines, and she kept saying, "Just sign where I mark so we can sleep." I did it because I trusted her and I was too tired to fight paperwork. Now I could see what she'd been doing while I was busy saving the company. She'd moved what she could into accounts in her name, separated anything liquid from anything exposed, and left me holding the ugly parts. Debts, guarantees, and the public fall. I flipped pages and saw lists of assets and neat percentages, all typed like it was already settled. Maren watched me with that calm gallery smile and said, "I married a builder, not a sinking ship, and I'm not getting dragged down by a man who couldn't protect the household." I didn't beg, because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction, and I didn't scream, because my throat felt packed with sand. The shame burned hotter than anger. Mostly because it was obvious she'd planned this long before tonight. She nodded toward the hallway and told me a small carry-on was packed. Then she said, "The car is complicated now, but I need the keys anyway," and she held out her hand until I dropped them there. I grabbed the bag, walked out, and the rain hit me like it was personal. My suit soaked through fast, and suddenly it felt less like clothing and more like a costume from the life I'd just lost. The door shut behind me and I kept moving because standing still would have turned into begging. Under a streetlight, I opened my wallet and counted what I had left with fingers that wouldn't quite stop shaking. I had $73 and a couple cards that were about to start declining any second. I didn't even swipe them because I couldn't take another calm voice telling me I was finished. The first place I went was Celeste Wynn's, because my dad's house still lived in my head like a safe address. On legal paperwork, she used Mercer, but in her club world, she kept Wynn like a brand, shiny and sharp. When I got there, the place was lit up like a magazine spread with valet lights, music, and laughter spilling through the windows. She was hosting one of her members-only cocktail nights, and every car out front looked expensive enough to insult me. She opened the door just enough to see me, and her eyes hardened when she took in my wetsuit and the bag. She stepped outside and used her body to block the warm light and the laughter behind her. "Not tonight, Tobin," she said, like she was turning down a solicitor. Then she leaned closer and hissed, "Do not embarrass this family in front of people who matter." She went back inside and shut the door so fast the latch snapped. I stood there a second with my hand still half raised, like I could knock and force the world to have manners. The music inside kept rolling, and a burst of laughter cut through the rain like a slap. I turned away because if I stayed on that porch any longer, I was going to make a loud scene I couldn't take back. After Celeste, I did the one thing I swore I'd never do, and I hated myself for even thinking it might work. I headed for Maura Lark's house, my mother-in-law, because she loved talking about compassion at church fundraisers like it was a skill she could show off. I told myself I only needed one night indoors, and that was a pathetic thing for a grown man to want. Her neighborhood looked like a brochure even in bad weather, all trimmed hedges and warm porch lights that made the wet streets glow. I stood at her gate dripping rainwater, feeling like a stray dog that had wandered into the wrong yard. A camera tracked me, and I could almost hear the judgment through the lens. A house staff guy in a dry jacket came out under an umbrella and looked me up and down. He didn't ask how I was doing because people like that don't get paid to care. He said, "Mrs. Lark will see you on the porch, sir," like he was doing me a favor by not calling the police. The covered porch smelled like expensive wood and candles, and Maura sat there with a mug like it was a normal evening. She took one look at my soaked suit and the bag by my feet, and she didn't bother pretending surprise. She said, "Marin already explained the situation," and her eyes stayed calm while mine burned. Then she added, "You made risky choices, Tobin," and she said it the way people talk when they're deciding who deserves help. I swallowed hard and kept my voice steady because cracking would have been the end of me. "I'm not asking for money," I said, and even that felt like a lie because everything felt like money now. "I just need one night indoors and I'll take the couch." Maura's mouth tightened like I'd offended her by existing in the wrong condition. She said, "A man's duty is to provide stability, and you failed at that tonight." She leaned forward a little and kept going. "A real husband does not bring chaos to a family name and then ask for comfort." She finished with, "This is not something I can allow under my roof." Then she opened her wallet, pulled out a couple bills, and tossed them onto the stone by my shoes like she was feeding a parking meter. I looked down and saw it was $60 total, damp already from the wind. Maura lifted her chin and said, "Bus fare and a hostel should cover your immediate needs." And she nodded at the staff guy like she was dismissing a waiter. The staff guy's voice stayed polite as he said, "I'm going to close the gate now, sir," and his hand went to the latch. I bent down and picked the money up because pride doesn't keep you warm, and I didn't have the luxury of pretending otherwise. My fingers shook, not from cold, but from humiliation that hit harder than the rain. I walked away while the gate clicked shut behind me, and I didn't turn around because I refused to give her that last look. I walked until my legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and the rain kept coming, steady and dumb, like the sky didn't care who deserved what. The only person left was my grandfather, Orson Mercer, my mom's dad, an old construction welder who fixed municipal buildings and lived near the industrial strip where nobody took pictures. Same last name as my dad, different line, because my mother was a Mercer before she ever met him, and Seattle loved its little loops. I hadn't visited Orson in a long time because I was always busy, and that excuse sounded disgusting now. The truth was I didn't like bringing my polished life into his worn-out hallway, and I owned that. I got on the bus with my wet bag and the cash I had left, rode past the bright neighborhoods into the parts of town that smelled like wet asphalt and freight yards. And when I stepped off near his block, I walked straight to his building and knocked. Orson's place sat under an old converted building, a basement studio with a single bulb over the entry that buzzed like it was tired of working. The paint around the door peeled in long strips, like sunburn coming off in sheets, and the concrete steps held a slick shine from the rain. I stood there longer than made sense, staring at that door like it might judge me before it opened. My jaw stayed clenched so tight my teeth hurt, and I hated that I was even here needing anything. When I finally knocked, it came out dull and heavy, like my knuckles were knocking on a coffin. The door opened fast, and there he was, 72 years old with hunched shoulders and work boots that looked welded to his feet. His hands were cracked and dark from years of heat and metal, and he held the door with a grip that didn't shake. His face changed the second he recognized me, like something softened without asking permission. He didn't hit me with questions about why I was soaked or where my car was, and he didn't ask why I'd vanished for years like a coward. He just reached out, grabbed my arm, and pulled me inside like it was automatic. "Get in here before you freeze," he said, and his voice wasn't gentle. It was certain, like he'd decided the situation and that was that. I stumbled in with my bag and he shut the door behind me with a solid click that sounded like safety. His apartment was tiny, the kind of space that forced you to live honest. A cot sat against one wall, a folding screen leaned like it was pretending to offer privacy, and a hot plate rested on a scarred counter beside mismatched cans. An old radiator clanked and rattled in the corner, coughing heat in uneven bursts, but even that ugly noise felt like a blessing. The air smelled like damp wool, metal, and soup that had been made 1,000 times. Orson tossed a blanket over my shoulders and pushed me down onto a chair like I didn't get a vote. "Sit down and stop wobbling around," he said, already moving toward the counter. He popped open a can, poured it into a pot, and set it on the hot plate with the kind of care people usually save for holidays. He slid a chipped bowl in front of me when it was ready and said, "Eat it while it's hot and do not argue with me tonight." I gave him the short version because I didn't have energy for anything else. I told him Keegan had emptied the accounts and vanished, and I told him Marin had paperwork ready like she'd been waiting for my lungs to stop. I told him Celeste shut her door in my face, and I told him Maura tossed money at my feet like I was a problem she could pay to disappear. Orson listened without making faces, just nodding slow, like he'd seen greed up close and didn't need it explained again. When I ran out of words, he looked at me and said, "You're here now," and he let that be the whole speech. I slept hard and ugly on that thin mattress, still wearing damp clothes because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The rain tapped the window in steady little hits, and the radiator kept clanking like it was guarding the room. I didn't dream about fixing anything, and I didn't picture revenge, because my body was too tired for fantasies. I just dropped into sleep like a stone. By morning, my body turned on me, like it had been waiting for permission to fall apart. My head burned, my joints ached, and my throat felt like sandpaper dipped in fire. I tried to stand and my legs didn't want to cooperate, so I grabbed the edge of the cot and swore under my breath. Orson was there right away, touching my forehead with his rough hand like he could press the heat back down into my skull. Then the radiator stopped and the room went cold fast, the kind of cold that crawled up your spine. I heard Orson on the phone in the next room, his voice sharp and stubborn as he argued with the building manager about the heat bill, and I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders while I listened. I stayed wrapped in the blanket while Orson argued on the phone, and then my mind slid sideways. The next few days came in broken pieces, his boots on concrete, the hot plate clicking, my own breath sounding too loud. He boiled water, wiped my face with a rough towel, and stayed close when the chills hit. When he thought I was out, I heard him whisper a prayer, plain and stubborn, like he was bargaining with the universe. One afternoon, I caught him sitting on the cot edge, shoulders rounded, staring at his hands. He pulled a little pouch from his shirt pocket and opened it like it might bite him. Inside was my grandmother's ring, the one piece of real sentiment he carried like a badge, and he rubbed the band with his thumb as if he could warm it. He didn't explain himself, he just closed the pouch, shoved it back in his pocket, and walked out into the rain. I tried to call after him, but nothing came out except air, and the effort burned my throat. Shame hit me in a clean, ugly wave, because I knew what that ring meant, and I knew what I was costing him. I lay there listening to the radiator cough and then die again, and the silence felt like debt. I stared at the door until my eyes watered, and I didn't know if it was fever or guilt. When he came back, he was soaked through and shivering, but his hands were full. He dropped a clinic discharge sheet on the counter, set down antibiotics and fever meds, and slid a paper bag of diner soup toward me. A small pawn ticket slipped out with his change, and he snatched it up fast. The radiator hissed back to life a minute later, and I understood he'd paid the building manager to turn the heat back on. That night I forced my eyes open and said, "Why did you do all this for me when I disappeared on you for years?" Orson didn't let me ramble or apologize, and he didn't pat my hand like I was fragile. He leaned in close and said, "Rings don't breathe, and you do. So drink the soup." I drank, and I made myself a promise right there that if I got back on my feet, he would never have to buy warmth with memories again. On the 5th day, the fever finally cracked, and the room stopped spinning long enough for me to sit up without seeing stars. My muscles still ached, but I could stand, and that felt like getting a weapon back. Orson left before sunrise with his lunch pail, because he kept moving so the world didn't swallow him, and he only tossed one order over his shoulder. "Rest if you have to, but if you can move, then make yourself useful," he said, and the door shut behind him. I took that order seriously because I needed to earn air in that tiny place. I swept grit into a dustpan, wiped down the counter, and scrubbed the floor until the water in the bucket turned gray. Behind a heavy dresser, my broom hit something that didn't sound like concrete, and it stopped me mid-swing. I crouched, ran my fingers along the base, and found a seam where plywood had been laid flush and disguised under years of grime. I dug a putty knife out of Orson's toolbox and pried the edge up, careful and slow. The board lifted, and underneath sat an old cookie tin, rusted at the edges and heavier than it had any right to be. My hands shook as I pulled it out into the light, because secrets have weight even before you know what they are. I snapped the lid open, and the first thing I saw was a faded photo of my mom, Nadine Mercer, holding me as a kid. That picture sat on top of everything, like my mom had been waiting under the floor for me to finally look. Under it was a sealed envelope and a folded letter in Nadine Mercer's handwriting. I hadn't seen her writing since I was a teenager, and my hands shook like I was stealing from a church as I opened it. She didn't waste ink on comfort. She wrote that she expected my dad to remarry, expected some status-hungry woman to circle our name, and expected me to need protection one day whether I believed it or not. She said love could be real and still come with teeth, and she wanted me to have something nobody could talk me out of signing away. The letter pointed me to the rest of the tin. There were old statements, beneficiary records, and clean copies of insurance and trust documents, all dated long before my company ever existed. My mom had sold land quietly, seeded a trust in my name, and built a life insurance structure around it, then given Orson one rule: hide it, do not open it, and do not tell me unless my back was against the wall. A name kept repeating in the margins, written in her steady pen: Conrad Phelps, estate attorney. Even before I understood the details, I could see this wasn't small time. When Conrad later walked me through it, the total value landed around $17.8 million, money walled off from my operating accounts and not something creditors or Marin could grab with a phone call. It didn't erase what I owed or fix the mess Keegan made, but it gave me a clean lane to rebuild and pay what was truly mine to pay. Orson came home that evening smelling like rain and machine oil, and he stopped dead when he saw the cookie tin on the table. I slid the photo and letter toward him and said, "This was under your floor, and I think it's from Mom." His eyes went wide in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Then he swallowed and nodded once. "She made me promise," he said, voice rough. "I never broke that rule, not even when I pawned the ring for your medicine." The next morning I sat at Orson's little kitchen table with the papers spread out like evidence, and called the number next to Conrad's name. A man answered on the second ring, calm and clipped, like he'd been expecting my voice for years. I said, "My name is Tobin Mercer, and I need to confirm something my mother set up." He asked a few identity questions, then said, "Bring the tin, your identification, and do not discuss this with anyone else yet. We'll do this in a way that keeps you safe." Conrad's office felt like the opposite of my life that week: warm, quiet, and controlled. He was 67, silver-haired, and not impressed by money, only paperwork and intent. He read my mother's letter without blinking, then looked at me and said, "Sudden wealth attracts the same people who slam doors when you are wet and broke." He laid out the structure in plain terms, showed me the walls she'd built around it, and told me exactly what it could and could not do. He arranged activation at a private banking branch and insisted I come in person with him, not alone, because he didn't trust luck and he didn't trust people. He also told me to document everything going forward, including who contacted me and when, because this kind of money turned conversations into traps. Later, he admitted the branch choice wasn't random at all. Marin's charity accounts banked there too, and if she was digging into my name, Conrad wanted her to show her hand fast with cameras and witnesses around. I didn't love being bait, but I told him yes anyway and started sliding the documents back into the tin. Conrad pressed the tin lid down, wrapped it back in a plain folder, and tucked it under his arm like it was nothing more than old tax records. I followed him out of his office with borrowed clothes that fit wrong in the shoulders, and I kept my chin up anyway because shame was how people controlled you. He said we were going straight to the branch, and he said it like a plan was a handle you grabbed and held. The bank felt like a different universe the second the doors shut behind us. All quiet floors and soft voices and that expensive air that never smelled like wet jackets. Conrad walked me through the final signatures, beneficiary verification, and security steps like he'd done it 1,000 times, sliding papers toward me and tapping the exact lines with his pen. "Read it, then sign it," he said, and his tone made it clear he didn't care if I felt intimidated. I signed with a steady hand on purpose, because I refused to look like a man who could be pushed around. When we finished, Conrad nodded once at the private banker and guided me back toward the lobby. That was when I saw Marin across the open space, perfect hair, calm smile, dressed like she belonged in every room she entered. She froze the second she recognized me coming from the private side with Conrad, and her eyes moved fast, flicking to my hands, to his briefcase, to the teller station like she was doing math in her head. I didn't give her a single word. I walked past like she was a stranger, and I didn't turn even when I felt her stare digging into my back all the way to the door. The next morning I woke up to an engine rumble that didn't belong on Orson's narrow street. 2 black sport utility vehicles rolled in slow, too polished for that block, and curtains twitched while a couple neighbors stepped out to watch. There was no polite way they found us that fast, and I knew they must have tailed us from the branch the day before. Orson stood behind me in the doorway, quiet but solid, and I felt my stomach tighten because I could already taste the fake sweetness coming. Marin got out first with careful steps and a soft voice ready to deploy, like she was walking into a donor luncheon instead of a wet street. Celeste followed right behind her wearing a concerned face like it was jewelry, and Maura came last, looking disgusted by the sidewalk as if it had insulted her. They swarmed the front walk together, talking over each other and reaching for me like the rain night never happened. "Sweetheart, we were so worried about you, and we came to make sure you are okay," Marin said, stretching the word like it could erase signatures. Celeste leaned in and added, "We can get you organized again because that is what family does when things get messy." I stepped back so none of them could touch me, and I kept my voice flat because loud would have been a gift to them. "Do not touch me, and do not step into this house," I said, planting myself in the doorway. "Whatever you came here to sell, I am not buying it." The whole block was watching, and I didn't care, because the only thing worse than being broke was letting them rewrite what happened. That's when Marin's mask slipped just enough to show teeth. She tilted her head and said, "You are not stable after losing your company, Tobin, and we might need to protect your decision-making for your own good." Maura nodded like a judge approving a sentence, and she said, "A man in crisis can be reckless, and responsible people step in before the damage spreads." Celeste kept her smile and said, "I can help manage things because the family has to protect its reputation, and you cannot do that alone right now." I understood it all at once, sharp and ugly, and it wasn't forgiveness they wanted. They wanted control, and Orson's little place was the soft target they thought they could intimidate. I didn't argue with them on the porch because I wasn't going to give them extra lines to twist later. I went inside, shut the door in their faces, and called Conrad, repeating word for word what they threatened while I stared at the deadbolt and kept my hand on the lock. Conrad picked up on the first ring, and I could hear office quiet behind his voice. I repeated what they said at the door, word for word, with my hand still on the deadbolt like it was the only thing keeping the predators out. He didn't gasp or get dramatic, and that steadiness got under my skin in a good way, because it meant he'd already been expecting this kind of move. "Listen to me, Tobin," he said, calm and clipped. "We handle it like we are building a tool bench, and we do it in order." He laid it out fast. First, a formal psych evaluation from an unimpeachable expert. Second, a recorded legal meeting with notices sent properly. Third, security. "You do not debate them on a porch," he added. "You do not meet them alone, and you do not sign anything without me sitting beside you." That same day he got me in with Dr. Selma Rios, a senior forensic psychiatrist with a reputation for not bending. Her office didn't feel warm or comforting, and I was grateful for that because comfort wasn't the point. She shook my hand once and said, "This is not therapy, Mr. Mercer, so do not try to charm me or fight me." Then she sat across from me with a legal pad and started protocol. Questions, timelines, stress testing, decision-making, and the kind of direct eye contact that made lying feel stupid. She asked about the fraud, the loan guarantee, the post-nup, the bank visit, and the threats at Orson's door. And she circled back when my answers got too tight. "Tell me what you did after you heard the threat," she said. And I told her, "I shut the door and called my attorney because I wanted a record." She didn't smile at that, but she wrote it down like it mattered. When we finished, she folded the papers, sealed her assessment, and said, "You are competent, oriented, and fully capable of managing your own finances." Like she was closing a file, not giving me a compliment. Conrad set the legal meeting for 3 days later at his firm, and sent formal notices that didn't leave room for excuses. He told me to bring Orson, not as a prop, but as a witness, because the threats were aimed at his home, and they were counting on him being easy to scare. He also arranged a security team and made sure the building's lobby cameras captured arrivals, because people like Marin behave different when they believed they were untouchable. "We are going to let them show who they are," he said, "and we are going to do it where it is recorded." On meeting day, I walked into Conrad's building with Orson beside me, both of us wearing that stiff kind of focus you get before a fight you didn't start. Security nodded us through like they already knew the plan, and Conrad met us near the conference rooms with a folder thick enough to hurt someone. "You will speak once," he told me under his breath. "You will speak plain, and then you will let me do the damage." Marin arrived with a polished attorney and that same public-friendly smile she used at charity galas. Celeste came dressed like she was attending a fundraiser, pearls and perfect posture, and Maura carried herself like she ran the city, and the world had signed off on it. They sat across from us like it was a business meeting and not an ambush, and their attorney didn't waste time easing in. "Mr. Mercer is traumatized," he said, voice smooth, "financially impulsive and vulnerable to manipulation by impoverished relatives," and he nodded toward Orson without saying his name. Marin put a hand on her own chest like she was playing the role of worried wife, not the woman who slid a folder across a coffee table. "I love him," she said, eyes bright and controlled. "And I only want to handle things until he recovers, because right now he is not making stable choices." Maura added, "This is about safety," like she was blessing the whole setup, and Celeste nodded along like reputation was a medical concern. Conrad didn't argue or raise his voice, which somehow felt meaner than shouting. He slid Dr. Rios's sealed evaluation across the table and let silence do the heavy work while their attorney read it. I watched the man's face change in real time, like air leaking out of a balloon he'd been proud of. Conrad followed with the second punch, laying out a timeline of Marin's post-nup execution, her asset transfers, and her sudden bank branch appearance the day the trust was activated, showing motive and pursuit instead of concern. I spoke once, exactly like Conrad told me to, and I kept it calm because calm scared them more than anger. "I will not sign power of attorney. I will not return to this marriage, and I will not allow any of you to harass Orson again," I said, looking at Marin like she was a stranger I'd learned to read. Conrad leaned forward and formally notified them that any further attempt to declare me incompetent would trigger countersuits, protective orders, and an inquiry into how Marin got private financial information so fast. Security walked them out, and Marin didn't scream or cry. She just stared at me with that cold look that promised she'd try another angle, right up until the elevator doors closed. On the drive back, Orson stared out the window at the gray streets like he was watching weather, not people. When we pulled up to his place, he finally turned, patted my shoulder once, and got out of the car. Orson shut the car door and headed for his basement steps with that same stubborn walk he used on job sites. I followed him inside and watched him set his keys down like nothing in the world had changed, even though everything had. I told him, "This place did what it needed to do, but I'm moving you somewhere warmer," and he shot me a look like I'd insulted his pride. He didn't argue yet, but his jaw tightened and I knew he'd fight me on it. I used a portion of the trust to get him into a modest, solid house, nothing flashy and nothing that screamed money from the street. It had a small yard, steady heat, and walls that didn't sweat in winter, and it was built for an old man who'd carried enough weight for one lifetime. Orson walked room to room like he was checking for leaks, then said, "You better not turn into a show-off just because you can." and I answered, "You better not sleep in a cold basement again just to prove something." He huffed, grabbed a box, and started unpacking like the decision was already done. Once Orson was set, I restarted my business smaller and tighter, because I wasn't going to rebuild the same weak structure and act surprised when it broke. I took fewer clients, wrote cleaner contracts, and held deposits with stricter controls that didn't rely on anyone's charm. I told my new bookkeeper, "No one gets unchecked access, and if anyone complains about the rules, they can walk." And she nodded like she'd been waiting her whole career to hear that. Every system had a second set of eyes, and every transfer required more than one person to approve it, because I learned the hard way what one smooth talker could do. Underneath all that rebuilding, the real work stayed running like an engine you couldn't shut off. Conrad brought in a forensic accountant, and I hired a quiet investigator to track where Keegan's money went. Not for revenge fantasies, but because my name was still tied to debts and fraud claims. The investigator met me in a plain office and said, "You want him found or you want your record cleaned?" And I told him, "I want the truth on paper so nobody can invent their own." Conrad backed it up with subpoenas and document requests that moved slow but hit hard. When the first real stack came back, Conrad laid it out in front of me and didn't soften his words. "Here are Keegan's shell accounts," he said, tapping lines with a pen. "And here are donation pipelines connected to Marin's charity fundraising world." The overlap sat there like fingerprints, and I didn't need imagination to see it. I asked, "So this wasn't random?" And Conrad replied, "No, Tobin, it was coordinated enough to be dangerous." That was the moment I stopped treating Marin like a betrayal story and started treating her like a risk that needed containment. Raina Cross, Maura's house manager, became one of my cleanest sources because she'd heard things people assumed staff would forget. Months later, she met me in a quiet coffee shop and kept her voice low while her eyes stayed on the door. "They were arguing the night after the bank," she said, and then she repeated the lines that stuck in my throat. How fast Keegan could move, and what to do if Tobin resists. I didn't ask her to repeat it twice, and I didn't try to make her feel brave, because she wasn't there for speeches. I told her, "If anyone pressures you, you call Conrad, and you tell them you have counsel." And she nodded once and walked out fast. Celeste tried her own angle, of course, and she didn't even hide it well once money got tight. Conrad showed me county filings that said she'd taken loans against my father's old house to keep her club life going, then fell behind when creditors tightened up. About 1 year after my collapse, Conrad forwarded me a federal case update that said Keegan had been pulled into a larger fraud investigation, and my documentation helped show who signed what and when. Marin's name sat on the edges of it in records Conrad walked me through, not something I could claim from a gut feeling. And Maura's philanthropy took a hit when donors got spooked by anything connected to the case. Celeste's social circle went quiet when the foreclosure notice hit, and I didn't dance about any of it. I woke up, made coffee, and unlocked my office door for another day of work. About 18 months after my collapse, on a Saturday morning, Orson and I stopped near a market strip for coffee and a sandwich after we picked up plants for his backyard. He loved messing with soil more than watching television, and he treated every new pot like a serious job. We were walking past a closed storefront when I saw Marin sitting on the curb under an awning, trying to stay out of a light drizzle. She looked thinner than I remembered, and her coat hung off her shoulders like it belonged to someone else. She wasn't holding a sign, but her hands trembled around a paper cup like she didn't know what to do with it. Her face had that shut-down look people get when pride finally runs out. I stopped without meaning to, and Orson stopped with me. I noticed the pregnancy next, not huge, but there, changing the whole picture in my head. For a second, my gut wanted to spit out every sharp word I'd swallowed since that rain night, but the sight of her sitting low to the ground kept my mouth shut. Marin saw us and stiffened. Her eyes darted to Orson, then back to me, like she was bracing for a punch that wasn't coming. She tried to stand and didn't quite manage it, so she settled back down and stared at the sidewalk. "Tobin, I didn't think I'd run into you," she said, and her voice sounded dry and careful. Orson looked at me like he already knew what choice I was fighting with. He didn't tell me what to do, and he didn't play referee. He just waited, hands in his jacket pockets, steady as a post. I didn't know the full story right then. Later, Conrad confirmed pieces from filings. Her accounts were frozen in the wider fraud case, and her safe world got pulled out from under her the way she tried to pull mine. The same filings made it painfully clear Maura cut her off the moment Marin became a liability. And Celeste's world didn't protect anyone once cameras and subpoenas showed up. Right there on the curb, though, I kept it simple. I walked into a small deli, bought a hot soup, a roll, and a bottle of water, and paid without looking at the total. I came back out and held the bag toward her without stepping close. Marin looked up like she expected me to spit words at her. Her eyes were wet, but she held her mouth tight, trying not to beg. I didn't lecture or forgive, and I didn't pretend we were friends. "I'm not doing this for you," I said. "I'm doing it so I don't turn into you." Orson squeezed my fingers and said, "You made your choice, and you did not lose yourself." Then I turned, took Orson's hand, and we kept walking down the strip, coffee cooling in the air, leaving her with food and the consequences she built. Before you roll on to the next video, can I put you on the spot for a second? If you've got the hype button, tap it to support this and help it reach more people. And please subscribe and hit like too. It's huge for us, and it's literally one click. Now tell me this. If someone who betrayed you ended up desperate right in front of you, would you help anyway to protect who you are, or walk away and let the consequences hit? Drop a comment, even good story, or share your take.